So you want to get started painting with gouache, but maybe you're feeling really overwhelmed by all of the different options that are out there. You might also be a little bit wary about investing too much money in this medium if you're not even sure that you're gonna like it. And trust me, I know when you start adding gouache supplies to your cart, that total number goes up really, really quickly. So I've totally been there. Either way, I've got you. I'm actually, in the grand scheme of things, kind of a noob in the gouache world. I've been painting with gouache and acrylic gouache, which I'll get to in a minute, for about 7 months now. So I think that puts me in a pretty good position to tell you, as someone who is kind of new to this medium, how I've started and what I've actually needed to use this medium. And I can definitely relate to the feeling of like not wanting to spend $1 million on these supplies when you first get started. So in the spirit of not gatekeeping all of our secrets, I want to share with you everything that you actually need to get started painting with gouache. All right, when it comes to painting with gouache, there are really 5 categories of supplies that you need. You need paint, you need something to put your paint on, something to paint with, something to paint on, and finally something to clean up your paint. So I'm going to go through each of these categories and I'm going to walk you through the things that I use and that I love to use, and I'll give you a couple of options for each of these whenever I have them. And remember, the goal here is not for you to go out and buy everything, but instead just to focus on exactly what you need to get started. And then you can run from there. So you won't find me telling you that you need 100,000 things to get started. Okay, so as I go through each of these categories of supplies, please at any point let me know if you have questions about any of the supplies that I mentioned. I am happy to talk you through my thoughts as I've used these for the last 7 months. And if you're a more experienced gouache artist and you have any additional tips, tricks, supplies that you love to use, please also share those in the comments because, well, I know that I would greatly appreciate it and benefit from whatever tips that you have. I know folks who are watching this video might also really be able to learn from your experience. Okay, let's do this, starting with the actual paint. I'm going to walk you through a few different paint sets that I've used, and I'll tell you my thoughts about each one. So my go-to set that I use for probably 90% of my gouache paintings is this Turner Acrylic Gouache 18 color set. I should say I'll leave a link to all of these things in the description if you're curious to see any of these supplies for yourself. This one is totally my go-to, and I'll be honest, when I first got it, I was a little intimidated and afraid of it. So before I dive kind of too deep in that, I want to take a step back and let's talk about gouache itself and how that differs from acrylic gouache. So something you'll hear all the time is gouache is in the family of watercolors in that it's water activated, but you typically get a matter, more opaque look with gouache than you do when you're using watercolor. And that makes it a really great medium for layering, and you don't have to follow all the same watercolor rules. For example, with gouache, since you can layer, it's totally possible to put lighter layers on top of some of those darker layers, which is awesome. Then there's acrylic gouache, which is what I use a lot of the time, and that kind of takes it one step further away from the watercolor realm. And so as the name kind of suggests, on the watercolor to acrylic spectrum here, acrylic gouache is going to be closer to the acrylic side because it still has a lot of the same properties of gouache, but it actually is not water activated like watercolor and gouache, and so once it dries, it's dry and that's it. You still get a similar type of opacity and ability to layer and that matte drying finish, which is really, really nice. So anyway, when I first got these Turner Acrylic Gouache, I was a little bit intimidated because this mixing set has a bunch of really bright, saturated colors. And as a total noob, I was like, I don't know what to do with this. And so my main tip, no matter what paint set you end up going with, is to spend a little bit of time learning about color theory. I can and should make a whole separate video about color theory and what I've learned about it, but I promise you, once I learned about the basics of mixing colors, it like opened a whole world for me because truly pretty much all of my paintings recently I've painted with these colors and that's it, and white. You'll see I have a big tube of white because I use this a lot, but this is all I need. And so you can look at all of these different sets of gouache that are 100 different tubes of paint, and that's really fun and really exciting. But at the end of the day, this is it. This is all you need. This is my best money-saving hack for this whole video, is instead of feeling like you need to buy these massive sets with all of these colors, instead Focus on a set that allows you to have just the mixing colors and spend a little bit of time learning about color theory. This will save you a lot of money, and it will like awaken your imagination and a side of your creative self that you didn't even know was dormant, right? Maybe that's dramatic, but this is what it was like for me. I actually will link a video in the description of this by Emily Hughes Art, and this is what woke up this color theory side of me, because she has this video about painting portraits in gouache, and she has a great explanation for how she mixes her colors for her portraits, actually using these exact same Turner acrylic gouache, those exact same ones I just showed you. So that was huge for me. If you're curious, go check that video out after you watch this one. It's so good. It's so good. Okay, the next paint set is this Holbein. I've heard both ways. Let me know if there's a right way to say it. But this set by Holbein, and you'll notice it's another pretty limited palette here. Sorry, this is kind of awkward to hold, but these are the colors that I have. It's just another little mixing set. I don't have 400,000 different colors. I just have kind of the core colors that I need to mix. This is also an acrylic gouache, similar to the Turner one. The texture is a little bit different. This I find to be a little bit looser than the Turner paints, and I like both of them. You know, I find it kind of interesting though, where I see more people online being like, these are the gold standard, like these are the best. I actually prefer the Turner paints personally. So up to you, totally worth trying both, but these are more expensive than the Turner paints. So take this all with a grain of salt and play with both of them if you can. It's fun, it's all good. But again, my core message is just get your mixing colors. That's all you need. All right, the last option I want to show you just because it's fun is this Sui gouache here. Sorry, I have tape over the top of it. But this is, you can see it says on there for aestheticist. Is that the right word? They're very aesthetically pleasing, these paints here. These are tiny little tubes. They are 0.25 fluid ounces. So 7.5 milliliters, little tiny guys, but I've had them for the whole time I've been painting with gouache, and I haven't even gotten close to using them all, so like it's been fine. They are really beautiful colors. I don't gravitate towards them as much as I do towards those Turner paints, but want to show them as an option in case you're curious in this set. I don't find they're as good for mixing. They kind of muddy when you mix the different colors for these, so I would use these more straight out of the tube and then focus on the others for a better mixing set. Okay, moving on to the next category of supplies, which is things to hold your paint. So you need some kind of palette, some kind of thing to put your paint on. And there are really two options here depending on what type of gouache you end up going for. So with the more traditional gouache, like I said, that is water activated. And so that is no problem if that gouache dries. You can just get it wet again, just like with your watercolor, and it's fine to use again for paint. That's like those Sui paints that I just showed you, those act in that way. So I often use just like this little ceramic palette that my friend got for me, and that works great for this. If you don't have a palette like this, I've also just used like a ceramic plate, like a dinner plate, and that worked totally fine. So for those gouache that is true traditional gouache, this is great. And then if you use the acrylic gouache, this is where things get a little bit different, because that paint, again, it dries, and once it's dried, it can't be reactivated with water. So you need a slightly different approach. I used to use like a ceramic plate, and it was really frustrating because it dried really quickly in like 5 minutes, and then that was it. You couldn't use it again. So I was wasting a lot of paint, and it was a really frustrating way to paint as well. So I started using something called a stay wet palette. You can actually buy these, and I have this giant one right here, and it basically, the way it works is it's kind of like a giant Tupperware container that has a really tight seal on the top. There we go. And then there's a special type of paper that comes with it. You can see mine has little cat paw prints on it. Welcome to my world. And then also a sponge in here. And basically the way it works is that you get this sponge wet and then you wring it out so that's not like soaking wet. And you actually also soak that paper and dry it out a little bit too. So you've got a wet environment here, not soaking, but a little bit damp. And so then when you put your paints on top of that paper and paint with it, they don't dry. And then when you're done with your paint session, you can close this with that lid, and those paints will stay wet for a long time. Like we're talking, I mean, I've had mine in there for like 2 weeks before, and it's been still wet. But totally my favorite hack on this list is to actually DIY your own stay wet palette if you don't have one of these store-bought ones here. And the way I do it is using this 1/8 sheet pan here, or a 1/4 sheet pan, or whatever you've got, something like this. I've even used like little Tupperware containers from like takeout whatever. Anything like this will work. And then I fold a couple layers of paper towel on here, or you could use like a microfiber towel, any kind of thing that would hold water. And then I wet that paper towel, and then I just put parchment paper on top of it, and that's it. And it works amazingly. I love it so much, and I personally sometimes like using this little one because it is so small versus the giant Stay Put palette I have. It just depends on where I'm working and what kind of space I have. But this achieves the exact same thing. You can do it at home. And then for me, when I am done using it, if I'm not done with my painting, I'll put like a cutting board on top of this, or just something big and flat, and it does a great job. A bonus tip that you didn't sign up for, but just learn from my experience, is one time I put a wooden cutting board on top of this, and be warned that since this is such a wet environment, it caused my wooden cutting board to kind of warp. So bear that in mind if you're not trying to warp any of your wooden cutting boards. Maybe use a plastic one. But this is such a great hack. Totally recommend it. Okay, moving on to the next category of things to paint with. So I'm talking about paintbrushes. And really, I don't do anything too fancy here. And so let me walk you through what I use. I kind of have two categories of brushes that I use for my gouache paintings. One are these round brushes. I use the silver black velvet round brushes because I've had these from my watercolor days. I started off in the watercolor world, and these are great for watercolor. And I was like, I already have these. Let me see how they do with gouache, and they do great with gouache. And so even with that acrylic gouache that dries faster and isn't water reactivated, yeah, these are great brushes. You just have to be a little bit more thoughtful when you are cleaning these out. But honestly, feel free to roast me for this, but I don't take super special or great care of my brushes. Like, I don't use any kind of, I don't know, like brush conditioner or brush cleaner or anything like that. I literally rinse them out with water after I use them, and that's it. That's all I do. And sometimes I'll like take a paper towel or something and just drag it and twist it like this when I'm drying it out, and that will preserve the point at the top, and that's it. That's all I do. So I've had these brushes for like a couple years, and I still use them all the time. So what can I say? I don't know. And then also when I'm painting with gouache, not so much watercolor, but with gouache, I use this really inexpensive set of flat brushes that I've had I got these for Christmas. So I've had them for about 5 or 6 months now, and they're great. I want to say this set was like $7, $8. There's even more than just these four. I think it's like maybe an 8 brush set, something like that. And they totally do the trick. I like painting with a flat brush with gouache for me personally, because my vision with my gouache paintings is to loosen them up, try and make them look a little bit more blocky, and these are great for that. So would totally recommend something like this. There's lots of other types of brushes that would be fun to play with. Like one on my list is a filbert brush. I think that'd be really cool, but I have been painting with my round brushes and my flat brushes for many, many months, and I'm happy with that. And you really don't need that much more than that. So those are my recommendations. Take that as you will. And let's move on to the next category. All right, next we've got things to paint on. And so by that, I mean paper, really. That's all I use. I'm sure you could paint on other surfaces, maybe, but I just use watercolor paper. So actually my favorite paper for my gouache paintings is this Fabriano Artistico cold pressed watercolor paper. This one's a big watercolor paper block that I have, which is really nice. It also comes in lots of different sizes. I started with a smaller size than this, and it was great. I really like it. But the reason I really like this particular paper is that it's cold pressed, which means it has that kind of rough texture. This paper has a slightly less rough texture than other cold pressed papers that I've used. For example, when I paint with watercolor, I use the Arches cold pressed watercolor paper a lot, and I love this for watercolor. It makes a huge difference, but it is a very rough texture. And this Fabriano paper is slightly more smooth. It's not like a hot press paper, which is smooth, but it's a little bit more smooth. And for whatever reason, I find it takes the gouache very, very well. So I like painting with this one. But honestly, I know that some of those papers can be really expensive. And I actually have also been sketchbooking a lot recently, and I really like to paint in my sketchbook. And I found that you can get away with using cheaper, lower quality paper with gouache or acrylic gouache a lot more than you can with watercolor. So this is a Royal Talons sketchbook, and I tried to use watercolor on it before, and it does an okay job, but it's not great with watercolor. It's not that much fun to paint with watercolor on this paper, in my opinion. But I've also painted with gouache on here, and it's great. I really love it. And so this is using the Turner acrylic gouache, but it holds it very well. The paper might warp a little bit, and that's okay. I mean, it's fine. It doesn't bother me too much. And so you don't have to break the bank and buy like a very big expensive pad of watercolor paper. You can get a kind of inexpensive sketchbook, and it might do a great job. like this one. So that's that. Okay, the final category of supplies is things to clean your paint with. So what I mean by that is basically containers of water and like something to wipe off your brushes. So I personally use a little mason jar for my water. You can see I've got paint marks all over this one. But this has worked great for me. And a fatal flaw of mine that I want to share with you is that I was just watching a video by Sketches of Shay, and she mentioned something that I've been thinking about, which is that if you use one jar of water while you're painting, especially with a medium like gouache, that water will of course get cloudy and dirty. And if you continue to use that as you paint, you're gonna muddy your paints. And I was like, duh, I mean, yeah, duh, this makes sense. But I have been using my same like muddy water for a lot of my paintings. So would recommend having 2 jars of water. Have one for your muddy, dirty water and like do your first big rinse of your brushes with that, and then use some clean water and change out your water regularly while you're painting. That's my pro tip. And then the very last thing, which might sound silly, but I just use a little paper towel to wipe off my brush after I have cleaned it off with water. You can also use an old rag or something like that, which I probably should do. I am the type of person who I have like a piece of paper towel that I use for like months. I wanted to show you my old ratty piece of paper towel, but I unfortunately just moved to a new apartment, so I don't think that my like months old paper towel has survived the move. But that's what I do, is I just use a little piece of paper towel, wipe it off that way. It's great for when I go outside, do it plein air or on the go or whatever. So that's it. That is really all you need. If you ask me, there's no need to overcomplicate things. As long as you have paint, a thing to hold your paint, a thing to paint with, a thing to paint on, and a thing to clean your paint, then you're all set. That's it. No need to go out and spend hundreds of dollars on new supplies. Start with the basics and go from there. So happy painting. Let me know if you have any other must-have gouache supplies to get started, or if you have any gouache tips or tricks that you'd like to share with me or my fellow gouache noobs out there. So as I mentioned, I'm only about 7 months into my gouache painting journey. So if you'd like to follow along on my journey to uncover my artistic voice and continue to develop my skills in gouache, I of course welcome you to subscribe to my channel. I'll be sharing all of that and my best tips as I continue to encounter them on this art journey that I'm on. And if you want to see me painting with gouache in action, then I recommend this video right here. It's very chill vibes and I'm painting the Irish countryside in gouache. I would really appreciate it if you could give this video a like if you think I've deserved it. And with that, thank you very much for watching this and for making it all the way to the end. And I will see you very soon in my next video. Take care, everyone.